This is Dr. Jerome Corsi, and today is Friday, August 4th, 2023. Thank you for joining us on thetruthcentral.com. We're going to do another special broadcast today. I'm going to continue on the themes of trying to explain how this neo-Marxism, this cultural Maoism, developed philosophically, how the ideas evolved. One of the disconnects, I believe, that is occurring is most people aren't aware of what's being taught in the universities. The kids are learning all of this Marxism, and most adults have not had an encounter with reading Marcuse or the Frankfurt School or the Post-Modernists from the French Post-Modernists. And I want to introduce people to it so we understand they live in a different world intellectually. Chris, if you'll show my book is in preparation right now. The first book out has done extremely well, The Truth About Energy, Global Warming, and Climate Change, because I really explain the science in a way people can understand it. And then we're going to be talking about Herbert Marcuse today, or Marcuse. That's the first book in a trilogy. It's a Great Awakening trilogy. And if you read this, you'll understand the climate science. You'll understand why everything you're being told about global warming is junk science. The Earth does have climate that changes, and changes for a lot of natural reasons, and it isn't because human beings are burning hydrocarbon fuels. We're going through a great hoax. The second book is about the truth about neo-Marxism, cultural Maoism, and anarchy. And this is the intellectual basis from which they come. So the first book is The Left Lies, the hard left lies about climate. They know they're lying. They want to destroy capitalism. The second book is about, here's why they lie. Here's their intellectual justification for it. Here's the intellectual world in which they live. Here's how they see things. And the third book is going to be about transhumanism. That's where they're going. That's where they want to end up. I haven't written that one yet, but I will probably start it later this year. Now, Herbert Marcuse, let's talk about who he was. He, in World War II in Germany, before in the 1930s, during the Weimar Republic, was a mess. Germany lost World War I, but did not really feel that they lost it. They felt they were sold out. The truth is, the United States entered World War I. We're talking about World War I. The United States entered World War I, and the fresh troops, the fresh money, equipment, we did make a big impact on Germany, but the war was essentially a stalemate in trenches. And Germany was collapsing internally for political reasons and also financially, the strain of the war. And Germany just quit the war, and they felt like they were winning. They could have won. Well, that's where Hitler comes in with all the resentment. And what happened in 1929 with the stock market crash in the United States is it caused a massive global recession, a depression, which I'm also quite worried could happen again right now. And again, it's because of the issues we're going to talk about today. So in that depression, Germany went into chaos, and two forces emerged. It was both on the left. The Nazis were National Socialists, with emphasis on socialist. They were a workers' party. And on the extreme left, you had the communists. And the two of them fought in the streets. They had street gangs, and they fought in the streets of the cities. And the winner of that battle were the Nazis. Now, the Nazis were socialists. They believed in the first ones to introduce universal health care paid for by the government. Government paid vacations. I mean, they provided goodies to the people who they were intending to abuse. And it was really about the combination of power in a small number of people, oligarchs, Hitler and his crew at the top, politically, and the multinational corporations at the top. And in the 1930s, Wall Street, including George H.W. Bush's father, Prescott Bush, on Wall Street, worked with the Nazis to finance them. the Nazis came into power in the 1930s, they were viewed as a positive force to get Europe out of the Depression. And there was massive money that was sent, and interlocking corporations. So Krupp's Steel, one of the major arms makers for Germany, and U.S. Steel had interlocking boards, interlocking directorates, interlocking shares. And Allen Dulles was very involved in all of this on Wall Street at the time, who became head of the CIA, and his brother John Foster Dulles, who became Secretary of State under Eisenhower. At the end of at the end of the 30s, when Hitler started going to gain power, which was 1933, he began to go after the Jews. And by 1938, the Jews were being rounded up. He started the war in 1938, 39, with going in Poland. I believe it was August 1st or August something or other, 1938. And he began the war. He had a pact with Hitler. And, they were not going to, the mutual non-aggression pact. They were going to work together, Stalin and Hitler. And so Russia was out of the war to start. One of the big issues in World War I was when Russia had its communist revolution in 1917, it dropped out of World War I. And Germany moved all the troops from Russia over to fight on the Western Front against the Allies, the French, the British, and then the Americans. And in World War II, Hitler did not want to start the war fighting on two fronts. He wanted to make sure he conquered France and Belgium. He'd take care of Hitler later. Now, in this period of time, all the Jews escaped and the communists escaped. And the Frankfurt School, which was a group of socialists who set up in Frankfurt, intellectuals, writing books and developing Marxism. They realized that Marxism had failed in 1848, and they wanted to revive Marxism. And they began being very influenced by a guy named Gramsci, who was an Italian communist, who said, you've got to wage a cultural war against capitalism. You got to destroy the culture. You've got to break up the families. You've got to get God out of the picture. Then we can take over. Okay, so Marcuse wasn't one of the leaders of that group. Actually, in Germany, he was kind of marginal. There were others who were more important in the Frankfurt School. But when he came to the United States, fleeing Nazi Germany, a Jew, he decided they first came to New York, where Columbia University was sponsoring them, but they ended up in LA. And they merged in with the Hollywood community. Was also very leftist. Even in the 1930s, Hollywood was moving left. And Marcuse began attacking the United States in a bunch of books. Now, I consider him the father of the New Left. Now, let me explain that for a minute. The New Left, first you had the left, which was in the United States for a long time, and it was basically just a party that wanted to take care of workers. It was take care of unions. It had a motive that was, in a sense, communist, but it wasn't outright communist. The New Left, which came into the 1960s, especially spurred by the assassination of Jack Kennedy, in which things changed, the civil rights movement took on a much angrier tone. During the Vietnam War, black protests became Black Panthers, it became revolutionary. And you had the hard left, which opposed the war, the hippies and the yippies and all the others that were anti-war, that were strongly trying to have a revolution leader. And there's not much about Marcuse that I find to be very favorable, but I want to point out a couple of things. We'll probably have to do several shows on Marcuse to really explain him, because it's complex. So the point is that when Hitler came to power, Marcuse joined in 1933. He was part of the Institute for Social Research in Frankfurt. That's the Frankfurt School. Marcuse never really worked at the Institute, but in 1934, he and his wife fled to New York to get away from the Nazis. They went to Columbia University. Marcuse became a U.S. citizen in 1940. 42, he actually worked in Washington as an intelligence analyst, first for the Office of War Information and then the OSS, Office of Strategic Services, which was the predecessor to the CIA. After he left government service, he taught at Harvard and at Columbia and at Brandeis. He got into a big dispute at Brandeis. He left Brandeis in 1965, and he wrote his first book, which was called One-Dimensional Man. Okay, One-Dimensional Man, I remember it distinctly. I was at Harvard when it came out, and I remember the Harvard bookstore buying a copy, reading this thing, One-Dimensional Man, had a big one on the cover of it. And Marcuse was saying his basic theme was that, people here work too much. We get into the habit of going to work every day. It's a materialistic society. We want to accumulate goods. And Marcuse, they didn't like materialism. They felt like this was not sufficiently elevated for them. They were intellectuals. They wanted to engage in higher level intellectual pursuits. They felt they were special. And they wanted Marxism. They wanted to destroy capitalism. Now, what Marcuse, and he's got a lot of paragraphs in here where, that just go on and on and on about all the things he finds wrong with, I'll try to find a few of the paragraphs and read them to you, but he is extremely critical of working people. And when he was in his best books, he lays out two themes that are pretty much dominant. Number one is, this book, by the way, all of his books here, they're very much influenced by Freud. So this is a psychological book in a lot of ways as well. The book has dimensions in which he's saying that Freud was all about sexuality is repressed. We're taught by civilization and by religion to not engage in sex. So Marcuse said, you work too much and you're too materialistic. And what we need to do is we need to have uninhibited sex. And so he was all for wild, uninhibited sex. And this Marcuse, the whole Frankfurt School, including his predecessors, became big advocates of Marquis de Sade. They liked the orgies. They liked the nature of the wild sexual abandon in Marquis de Sade. And that became a core principle of the Frankfurt School, sex. Now, in the period of time where the new left, this revolutionary groups, were at the fore. They loved the idea of sex, drugs, and rock and roll. The sex, drugs, and rock and roll was a theme of the 1960s. After Jack Kennedy died, the world changed with the assassination of Jack Kennedy. And it became very much more anarchy. And then going into the Vietnam War, which Jack Kennedy was not going to do. He was going to pull out of the Vietnam War. He'd been to Vietnam. He knew how corrupt it was. He wasn't going to get sucked into that pit. Lyndon Johnson wanted the war. The military industrial establishment that Eisenhower warned us about wanted to be in the war because they were going to make a lot of money. Now, Marcuse comes out of the tradition of Marx and Hegel. He is a Marxist, but again, he's a Marxist with this new left appeal. So what he did was, let me see if I can find, here's a quotation by someone who studied the Marxism. And he said, basically, originating in the interpretation of Hegel and Marx as prophets of a rationalist utopia, Marcuse developed this into an ideology of global revolution in which the sexual liberation played a prominent part, which the working class was rudely displaced from the center of attention to make way for students, racial minorities, and the lumpen proletariat, which is another term for a broader group of not just workers, minorities in general. In the 70s, Marcuse's importance faded, but his philosophical impact was still there. And so Marcuse himself acknowledged he was a celebrity in the 60s. He embraced the youth revolution. His next book was Eros and Civilization. Okay, now Eros and Civilization was all about sex. And the whole book is, that's why this book flew off the shelves. Everybody was reading it in the 60s at Harvard and all across the country. The universities just caught on wildfire with this book. It was written originally in 1955, but it caught on in the 60s. And the paperback edition of it is what caught on. It was a blue cover paperback. And you can pick almost any random paragraph you can pick out where he hates the technology. He hates the technology. He thinks the technology is imprisoning us. I'll just pick out a paragraph. He said, "Technics provides the basis for progress. Technological rationality sets the mental and behavioral patterns for productive performance and power over nature. We control nature by our technology, and that's capitalism." Has become so power over nature technology has become practically identical with civilization. Is the destructiveness sublimated in these activities sufficiently subdued and diverted to assure the work of Eros? In other words, because we're working so hard with technology, we're trying to master, the civilization has become repressive. Don't get enough sex. So he says, to be sure, the diversion of destructiveness from the ego to the external world secured the growth of civilization. However, extroverted destruction remains destruction. Its objects, in most cases, actually and violently assailed, deprived of their form, and reconstructed only after partial destruction. Units are forcibly divided, the component parts forcibly rearranged. Now, these people are very hard to read because they write in this kind of abstract language. But what his last sentence in this paragraph says, destructiveness in extent and intent seems to be more directly satisfied in civilization than the libido. So he's saying what Freud said, civilization, and Rousseau said, man is born free and everywhere is in slaves. And they blame civilization. So his utopian ideas, Chris, what do you think of this so far? Let me get Chris to comment on this so far, because I can ramble on with this for a long time, but it is amazing stuff that these guys, and it was very seductively powerful. You tell, 18 to 25-year-old kids that they will liberate themselves by having sex, drugs, and rock and roll. You got a seller.
Of course. Why not? I'm not sure about the rock and roll on his end, but the fact is...
Oh, he liked the rock and roll, too.
Okay, well, that's fine. I'll go with the rock, but the fact is you can sell... What you're basically telling young people is do what you feel like doing. Don't worry about the consequences. Everything will be fun and games no matter what. You'll all feel better. Or I believe the colloquial term is if it feels good, do it.
You don't need that stinking mathematics and science. You don't need to learn how to write all these things.
That's what we have now. Yeah, that's what we have now.
Well, that's where I was headed. That's where he was setting the basis for that.
Right. But now, if it feels bad, don't do it. That's what's going on now. If it feels good, do it was the Marcuse in the 60s. But now it's the far left saying if it feels bad, don't do it. Don't bother with math. We'll call it racist. We're living in a utopian society. You don't need anything. By the way,
but at their core,
right?
See we put it together with postmodernism. Postmodernism says you create your own reality. All reality is subjective.
You'll own the thing and you'll like it.
Well, and we get there,
right?
But the transition is Marcuse is transitional in that regard. He's going from Marx, which said the workers of the world will unite. That failed, and he's creating to break the culture. He's latched on to Freud and trying to liberate sex. And once he can do that, he can get rid of God. And then he can basically enter a subjective reality. And the next step, which I'll tell you in a minute where he ends up, is then you imagine the utopia we're going to have. You've got to imagine it. So they don't tell you what it's going to be because they don't have a utopia. The fact is, human beings are faced with some fundamental facts which the Marxists and the postmodernists don't want to accept. One of the facts is we got to sleep 6 to 8 hours a night. In other words, we got to eat 2 or 3 times a day. In other words, we need some basic needs taken care of. We got to stay out of the rain. Can't live in the elements. So all these things produce in human beings the necessity to do practical things to survive. These people think the machines can do all that. Marcuse is very big on we make the technology produce for us what we need, and then we don't have to work. We can engage in arts and sex and higher intellectual pursuits. That's their utopia. Now, a society that's going to aim there is promising people something that is probably just never achievable. Because the fact, what they want to ultimately eliminate is the idea you're going to die. You're going to get old, you're going to die. Oh, no, we don't have to do that. We can have transhumanism. Okay? So it's transition. I want to read a little bit more, Chris, and then I'm going to come back to you for a second. So he says, as an aesthetic phenomenon, the critical function of art is self-defeating. The very commitment of art to form vibrates the negation of unfreedom in art. In order to be negated, unfreedom must be represented in the work of art with the semblance of reality. The element of semblance necessarily subjects the represented reality to aesthetic standards and thus deprives it of its terror. Moreover, the form of the art invests the content with the qualities of enjoyment. Okay, so where he's coming down to is that you've got to have art that is combined with eros, with this impulse of sex, this impulse of uninhibited love and uninhibited, really sex. He really means sex. And they quote a lot of German, these guys do. All these writers quote a lot of their words in German. They end up, but he goes in, he says, insofar as sexuality is organized and controlled by the reality principle, reality principle is you've got to eat every day, you've got to sleep, etc. Fantasy asserts itself chiefly against the normal sexuality. However, the erotic element in fantasy goes beyond the perverted expressions. It aims at erotic reality, where the life instincts would come to rest in fulfillment without repression. Okay, so the critical idea is to take this eros, this sexual energy, and to elevate it out of the reality principle, which is repressed. Only one wife, only one husband for a lifetime, growing old together. No, that term doesn't work. What he wants is to combine eros with this higher instinct, which he calls this life instinct, which is constantly young, constantly new, constantly uninhibited. Okay, and so that's the ideal state of nature that they want to live in and they want to create. Okay, and he's open about it. Freud's conclusions, he rejects some of Freud because Freud believed that repression of all these instincts was somewhat necessary for civilization to occur. And he agrees with Freud that libido is the primary motivator of human beings, but he wants it completely unrepressed. And he wants to live in a society which is controlled by the machines. And so he's setting the stage. This critical theory leads into transgenderism. It leads into transhumanism, leads into artificial intelligence. Because what these people are trying to do is transcend the human nature to be a more godlike status in which we don't have to worry about basic needs. Don't have to worry about growing old. We don't have to worry about someone else's emotions because it's a free love society. And these are the kinds of seductive, and so therefore everybody should be able to express who they are. Whatever your gender is, you should be able to express it. Whatever your race is, whatever you decide you want to be. And we should accept everybody's they embrace schizophrenia because they don't have any idea that there's an objective reality. Objective reality is what they want to tell you you can transcend. Okay, now where it goes and where it ends up is he had another book. This was another book from the 60s, Critique of Pure Tolerance, and it had 3 writers in it. The most influential of them was Marcuse, who wrote an essay which is extremely influential. It's called Repressive Tolerance. And what Marcuse said is that we don't need a First Amendment. We don't need free speech. We don't need toleration, because toleration lets people who have repressive ideas, who want to talk about capitalism, who want us to go backward, get to speak freely, and their ideas can be convincing of people, and they ought to be shut up because they're blocking our way to utopia. So he writes extremely aggressive passages which say basically that you can only speak if you are liberated. And he says toleration of speech is what he hates. Okay, so he says he calls it the subversive majority, which wants to block, wants to organize repression and indoctrination, and they want to use speech for undemocratic means. That's where this democracy comes in. When the left talks about democracy, they don't mean everybody voting. They mean everybody self-actualizing. And self-actualizing is part of, and anyone who doesn't accept or embrace self-actualizing is got to be eliminated. It says to discuss tolerance in such a society, his society that he's imagining is utopia, means to re-examine the issue of violence and the traditional distinction between violent and nonviolent action. Discussion should not from the beginning be clouded by ideologies which serve the perpetuation of violence. Okay, so nonviolence is normally not only preached to, but exacted from the weak. So he's saying in terms of the historical function, he wants there to be a revolutionary pressure to quash reactionary violence, which he takes to be the spreading of an ideology of capitalism or God. These ideas are not to be tolerated because he wants only liberated ideas. So he says when tolerance mainly serves the protection and preservation of a repressive society, when it serves to neutralize opposition and to render men immune against others and better forms of life, like his idea of uninhibited sex, then tolerance has to be perverted. Okay, so this perversion starts in the mind of the individual and his consciousness, his needs, etc., and it works its way into society. So the forces of emancipation can be liberated, and progress in freedom advances when only pure thoughts in political education are allowed to prosper in the society. Okay, that sets up the basis for a cultural revolution. It sets up the basis for the left to be intolerant. Left doesn't have to be fact-based because they view your facts as repressive, as part of the capitalist society they're trying to eliminate. They want to break free of all these chains. They're fundamentally Rousseauian. They don't like society. They don't want to fit into an orderly structure. They want to be uninhibited, liberated. Okay, now these are ideas that have become extremely pervasive, and it's morphed. Because in the 60s, it was all about free love and the hippies and smoking dope and all the other activities that went on, which many of the people who were engaged in grew up and stopped doing. Okay, others of us, like myself, thought it was crazy to begin with. But it morphed into where it got into the repressive tolerance. And now what they were taught was that the evil nature of America, these guys, Marcuse and the rest of these Frankfurt School guys would have been in the gas chambers. We brought them here, and they created this ideology to create a cultural revolution in the United States and turn the United States into a communist country. They did not believe in God, or they hated God. It's a combination. Like Marx was not an atheist. He knew God existed. He hated God. He resented God. He wanted to be God. And these people did too. So today they turn against America. America's a racist country. Capitalism, imperialism, got to be destroyed. And they are willing to engage in lies to do it because they don't believe they have to have facts. Your facts are simply how repressed you are, how captivated you are by the chains that you don't want to let go of. Now, Chris, we've got about a minute here for a comment because I've got some time limitations at the moment, but I've said what I wanted to say on this today. We will return to these themes, but your thoughts, please.
Well, once again, if you look at today's left, they go back into these, they sort of exponentially look at Marcuse's ideas of a utopia, but they're still not telling you what that utopia is.
They never do. They never do.
The World Economic Forum is saying you'll own nothing and you'll like it. You'll be very, very happy. The fact is, every utopia has a very small hierarchy and a very large dependent class.
And they're very vague about what the utopia is going to be.
Right.
You know, we're all self-realized. Well, what does that mean? You know, I mean,
utopia for them.
It's a utopia for them because they're going to have the money and they're going to have the power and they're going to have the jets, and we are all serfs and we're not needed. 15-minute
cities. That's all we're going to need. Stay in the bubble.
Okay. We're going to wrap this one up. It's going to be a continuing series of themes. We're going to do special programs on this continuously until we get these ideas out enough. These books are hard to read. They're crazy, but they're essential to understand because this is the intellectual world in which the left, the hard left, the common neo-Marxist left, and the cultural Maoism lives in. And what they produce is anarchy. They don't produce utopia. They produce anarchy. This is Dr. Jerome Corsi. This is Friday. It's August 4th, 2023. I always say in the end, God always wins. God will win here as well. I also say join me in spirit of 2 Chronicles 7:14. We've got to repent that we let this country get to this point. We let the world get to this point. We've got to return to God. And God can heal this land, but I think it's at the point where God's going to need to. And I hate to think what the judgment of God is going to be if we don't do our part. This is thetruthcentral.com. We're doing podcasts every weekday. Thank you for joining us. God bless.